It's Emily OFC Podfix. Flashpoint. Written by It's Emily OFC. Read by It's Emily OFC. Chapter 2. Kakashi stood still in the charred remains of what had been his go-to convenience store, watching as his teammates exited into the bright fluorescent-lit parking lot just outside the building. It was a habit of his to ensure that he was the last out of a building after a job. It brought him peace of mind to know that everyone was out safely before he took his own leave, especially the probies. This time, though, he had another reason for hanging back. They'd extinguished the fire emanating from the fryer behind the store counter without much difficulty, but had also had to hose down a bevy of flames that had been licking up and down the small store's aisles. And now, as Kakashi removed his SCBA mask to get a closer look at the particular aisle he was standing in, he had the impression that something was off. Glass crunched under his feet as he shifted his weight to crouch down, peering at the chalky aftermath of heat damage to the lower shelves on the metal merchandise display. "Lieutenant?" Kurenai's soft voice barely broke through his rapid-fire thoughts, and without looking up, Kakashi responded with his characteristic, "Please don't call me that," automatically. "Should I get Shizune?" Kurenai asked, heeding but not acknowledging his statement, and Kakashi looked up at her this time. She was hovering at the door, her own mask removed as well. Her features were soft, but Kakashi had worked with her long enough to know she was one of the toughest firefighters in the city. And she knew him well enough to know that his staying behind for this long meant that he was seeing something she wasn't. "Yes, please," Kakashi replied, turning back to the display he had been inspecting. He listened as the muffled noise from just outside rang clear when the door was opened once again. They'd entered the building from the rear, and so the glass front doors were still intact. Outside, the distinctive sounds of a curious crowd of civilians could be heard over the sounds of his own crew asking them to please stay back. So familiar was the noise that Kakashi could picture them, standing on their tiptoes, smartphones in hand, almost gleeful that something interesting was finally happening in their neighborhood. It was a reaction he understood, but it had always sickened him to some extent. At least there were no injuries or fatalities this time. That always made it worse. The crowd was quieted once more as the door swung shut, but before it latched into place, it was opened again as Shizune entered the building, her boots tromping heavily through the wreckage on her approach to Kakashi. Kakashi was standing now, eyes downcast toward the soot-covered ground. He toed a floor tile with his boot, prying it up to show his lieutenant the underside as she came to stand beside him. "It's vinyl," he said, glancing up at Shizune. Her expression was a serious one, as it so often was. He could see her working it out for herself as her eyes traveled from the floor up the display, then turning around to survey the path of the fire from the fryer behind the counter, eyebrows furrowing lower and lower over her eyes as she put the pieces together. "Vinyl doesn't catch like this," Kakashi said, gesturing to the blackened floor tiles that led from behind the counter to where they were standing. Shizune knew as much, of course. "Fires don't travel across vinyl floors." Shizune took her helmet off with a sigh, turning to fully face Kakashi. "You're right," she agreed. "If it traveled naturally, it would have caught on the merchandise and burned downward, not from the floor up." Kakashi nodded. "Is law enforcement here yet?" "They are," she confirmed. "I'll have them call a detective." "Look alive, people!" Tsunade's voice boomed within the small conference room. "Your shift isn't over yet, and I want a full hot wash on the A&C convenience call-out before any one of you even thinks about sleeping." Everyone straightened up in their seats a bit, knowing that if they didn't visibly respond, the yelling would only get louder. "Well?" Tsunade asked, crossing her arms over her not inconsiderable chest. Someone start! Yes, ma'am, Shizune replied obediently, ducking her head deferentially. The call-out was reported as, Not you! Tsunade interrupted, holding a manicured finger up in front of Shizune to silence her. Not you either, Hatake! She continued, swiveling in her seat so that her finger was now squarely in front of Kakashi's face. He hadn't even opened his mouth. We all hear enough from you two. I want to hear from someone else. Umino! The rookie at the far end of the table's shoulders shot up so high that they nearly touched his earlobes, and Kakashi saw his tan features flush with embarrassment and surprise at being put on the spot. He stuttered, clearly panicking. Too slow! Tsunade cut him off. Inuzuka! She turned her attention to the other probationary firefighter on the crew. Structure fire reported, Hana supplied, her voice almost sounding too calm in contrast to Iruka's. We responded. Building owner was present. Fire was evident on side Alpha of the structure, so we proceeded to side Charlie to gain entry. Ignition source was determined to be a commercial fryer. We extinguished the ignition source and secondary combustion zones without injury. Tsunade nodded approvingly, and Kakashi saw Iruka slump a bit in his seat. He felt a twinge of sympathy for the newbie. Tsunade wasn't an easy captain to start under. He'd seen Iruka's capabilities in the month since he'd come on board and was certain that he had what it took, but he'd have to gain some confidence before he'd make it at Station 15. And how did you, personally, determine that this was a possible arson case? Tsunade asked, attention still directed at Hana. The young firefighter's confidence faltered, and Kakashi saw her eyes shift uncomfortably in his direction before she answered. I did not personally determine that arson was a possibility. That's right, Tsunade shot back. I sent a crew of 6 supposedly capable firefighters out tonight, and only 1 did the job properly. This wasn't a hot wash, Kakashi concluded. It was a lecture. Do you all think our job is just to put out fires? A monkey with a hose can do that. You all have been through the training, especially those of you fresh out of the academy. Hana and Iruka were on the receiving end of a quick but scathing glare. Your job is to observe and use your brains. If Shizune hadn't been there to see what the rest of you missed... I'm sorry, Captain, but I must interrupt. Guy's voice, as loud, if not louder than Tsunade's, erupted through the room. He had stood up, for some reason. Tsunade pursed her lips but waited to hear what he had to say. Guy wasn't one to disrespect authority without a good reason, after all. You are correct that only 1 on our team identified the signs of arson, but it was not Lieutenant Kato. Guy flashed an impossibly charming smile before pointing far too dramatically at Kakashi. It was Kakashi! The room was momentarily silent before Genma let out a low whistle, earning himself what Kakashi figured must have been a kick under the table from Kurenai, from the way he winced and cursed under his breath. Is this true, Shizune? Tsunade asked, eyes narrowed and a frown tugging at the corners of her glossy lips. Yes, ma'am, Shizune confirmed, eyes downcast. If I may, Kakashi offered. Lieutenant Kato was directing work from outside of the building. She recognized the same signs I did as soon as she entered the structure. Thank you, Kakashi, Shizune said softly. Kakashi watched as Tsunade's eyes shifted back and forth between the two of them, trying to decide how to proceed. Finally, she placed her palms flat on the table and rose to standing, leaning forward intimidatingly. Regardless, she said, the bite back in her voice, this crew has clearly started to let its skills degrade. Be prepared to repeat all 3 training modules on arson next week. She spared a moment to stare down Genma, the only crew member who might have had the audacity to complain, but he was silent. And if you don't, none of you are going to the department's holiday party. With that final threat, Tsunade marched out of the conference room, leaving the crew to their own devices. "Nice going, Hatake!" The words were out of Genma's mouth before the conference room door had even completely clicked shut. "Genma," Kurenai chastised, "it's not Kakashi's fault." "No, it's not," Shizune agreed. "Captain Senju is right. Kakashi shouldn't have been the only one to catch the signs." Yeah, Genma waved a hand in her direction. "But we could have told her that we all noticed it together. She didn't have to know." "Wouldn't that be dishonest, though?" Head swiveled in surprise at the sound of Iruka's voice. Hana had been known to speak up occasionally since she'd joined the crew, but Iruka had been largely silent unless spoken to. "Yes, probationary firefighter Iruka Umino," Guy agreed wholeheartedly. "Excellent point." The statement was perhaps a bit too congratulatory, but Iruka beamed under the praise nonetheless, perhaps intentionally ignoring Genma's exaggerated eye roll. "What's the big deal anyway?" Hana asked curiously. "A week to get 3 trainings done? Should be a piece of cake." "Yeah, should be. If we don't have too many call-outs. And let's not forget it's oven fire season," Genma shot back. "Oven fire season?" Iruka asked curiously. "The holidays," Shizune responded, looking as though she shared the same sentiment as Genma, but was too polite to express it in the same way. "People cook a lot more than they do the rest of the year. We always see a spike in residential kitchen fires this time of year." "Damn it," Genma lamented. "The holiday party has an open bar. Now we're going to miss it because of Lieutenant Smarty Pants over here." "Don't call me Lieutenant," Kakashi bit back, more irritably than he had meant to. "Cheer up, team!" Guy shouted, clapping one hand each on Genma and Kakashi's shoulders. "We will complete all of our trainings and more without fail, and we will attend the holiday party victoriously." While Guy's statement failed to rouse the troops in perhaps the way he had hoped it would, it at least signaled the end of the discussion as the team wearily rose to their feet, most headed to their bunks with the hope of catching a few hours of sleep before the end of their shift, provided there were no more call-outs that night. Kakashi wasn't sleepy, though. He was tired, of course. Nothing wore out the body quite like lugging over 100 pounds of hose through a burning building. His mind was wide awake, though, still sifting through mental images of the desecrated A&C convenience store. In truth, he'd had an advantage in detecting the evidence of arson. He knew before they had even arrived on scene that the floors in the store were vinyl. He knew so because he had walked over them probably thousands of times in the past 5 years. The store was a regular stop for him on his way into work. He'd stop in for a black coffee, an apple, and a newspaper before nearly every shift he'd ever worked at Station 15. It was surprising, actually, that almost after a decade of fighting fires, this was the first time he'd been called out to the scene of a place that he knew well. The gym he frequented had burned down a month or so ago, but it had been another station's jurisdiction, and he hadn't found out about it until he read about it in the paper. This was different. It was jarring, especially since all signs pointed to the act being intentional. That was in the hands of the detectives now, of course, but Kakashi couldn't help but wonder who would want to burn the place down and why. "Can I ask you something?" The sound of someone standing so closely behind him startled Kakashi, but he had plenty of experience in self-control and suppressed the urge to flinch, instead turning slowly around from where he was standing at the window to face Iruka, the newbie, who apparently wasn't interested in sleeping either, though it had to be nearly 3 a.m. by now. "Sure," Kakashi agreed, interest piqued. "Why do people call you Lieutenant if you aren't one?" Kakashi turned back to the window to hide his frown from Iruka. It wasn't the type of question he had been expecting. It was dark outside, though, and now that he wasn't too lost in his own thoughts to see anything, the window reflected his frown back at him, forcing him to contend with the way the question made him feel. "I used to be," he said with a shrug. "People have trouble breaking habits sometimes." Oh, Iruka responded, sounding as though he was worried he had crossed a line. Sorry, I didn't know. Kakashi lifted a hand and waved it dismissively. Don't worry about it. The last thing he needed was the rookie feeling bad for him. Do you really think we won't get to go to the holiday party? Iruka asked, changing the subject mercifully. Kakashi replied pensively, shifting a bit until he could see Iruka's reflection in the window too and locking eyes with him. I don't know. I guess I really don't care. He watched, amused, as Iruka's eyes widened in surprise. You don't? The man asked. Kakashi turned around to face his newer teammate fully and shoved his hands into his pockets. He smiled, closing his eyes as he did. I don't want to go anyway, he admitted, before raising a hand in a gesture of parting and slinking out of the room. It's Emily OFC Podfic.